Good morning. Thank you guys for all joining us to listen to our patient experts that we've brought here today. My name is Julia Jenkins. I'm Executive Director and Board President of the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. We are a policy and advocacy organization that is dedicated to ensure that the patient voice is heard in policy advocacy and in drug development. And I think I'm biased, but some of the most amazing patient advocates here this morning to share their experience. In 2012, there was new legislation passed called patient-focused drug development. We actually have Pat Furlong who led that legislation, but that requires that the patient voice be incorporated in drug development. And that is happening, but there's still a lot of people out there that work at companies that are, how do we do this? So hopefully our patient experts here today will share a little bit about what they do as sometimes volunteers, sometimes paid FTEs at patient organizations. But rare disease patients are very different. There are 10,000 different rare diseases. Less than 5% of those actually have an approved therapy. When you get diagnosed with a rare disease, there isn't often a patient organization. There isn't a researcher that is looking into your disease, and that burden of actually getting a diagnosis and developing a treatment often falls on the patient and parent advocate. And once the patients have found a researcher, funded the research, then they have to go convince people like you with biotech companies and pharma companies to actually develop the treatment. And then they are there to advocate for FDA approval and access in the access environment. So really, this is not the work of charity. This is the work of true expertise at patient organizations that play a vital role in the drug development process. So I'll let everyone introduce themselves, and then I have a few questions of my own, but we'll also hopefully have a little bit of time for audience questions. So Everin, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Hello everyone, my name is Everin Ike. I am from Fresno, California. I attend California State University, Fresno, and I live with the rare genetic disease acid sphingomyelinase deficiency.
Great. Pat?
Hi, I'm Pat Furlong. I'm really happy to be here. I'm from Middletown, Ohio, and that's probably nowhere compared to people from California. It's a very small town. I represent Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, or easier to say, PPMD, and we focus on Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Panagoulias. I represent the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, or what we call FAST, and I came to the foundation because my niece Samantha lives with Angelman syndrome.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Shapiro. I'm fifth generation of mothers in my family to have a child with sickle cell disease. And I'm representing Sick Cells, which is a nonprofit that helps to elevate the voices of people living with sickle cell disease.
Hi, I'm Christine Wagner, and I'm the president and co-founder of the Cure GM1 Foundation for a lysosomal storage disease called GM1 gangliosidosis. And sadly, my daughter, Iris, was diagnosed with GM1 at age 5, and she's now 15 years old.
So you can tell we have some amazing advocates here. I do want to start just a little bit to talk about patient-focused drug development. I'm going to call on Pat because in every other product that's developed outside of medicine, you know, if you're developing an iPhone, you're getting input from the customers, right? You're getting input from the consumers of what they want, so you know what they will pay for. But in drug development, that wasn't happening. It was really the physicians or even the clinical trial designers were determining what the patients wanted in a treatment. And it was the patient community that led the work to change how drug development was done. So Pat, do you want to just give a little blurb about what PFDD is and how it came to be?
Sure. So PPMD started a long time ago, 30 years ago, and this is at a time when Duchenne and many, many rare diseases weren't even recognized. There was really no interest in them. And the whole thing is about patients is they usually know their disease. They know how they feel. They know what drugs they want to take, what drugs would be helpful to them, and they want safe and effective medicines. safe, and effective medicines. So as we started out PPMD, we began to convene what we called forums. And those forums were in Washington, where we would bring together the physicians, because when you get a diagnosis of a rare disease, you have to find a physician who recognizes this. You have to find basic scientists. You have to fund them. Then you have to think about getting industry involved and then figure out how that's going to work in terms of your opinion, your need, your desire, what value you have in what industry is developing. So we had these forums, and that would include all of our community, physicians, basic scientists, patients, and their families. We would talk about how it means and what it feels like to live with Duchenne across the trajectory of this disease, and what value you place on benefit and risk. How much benefit do you want, and how much risk will you take? We then began interacting with FDA to provide that patient data, and we felt like patient-focused drug development, if you're not focusing on the patient, then you're not developing something that they may need or want. So we decided that one of our aspects would be to start thinking about policy and legislation. So we did with our champions, and we met people across Congress to talk to them about the need to fundamentally include the patient across the drug development paradigm. And I will say that they're there already. It's just that sometimes industry comes in and forgets that they're there. Because in a rare disease, you find those basic scientists, you raise money and give it to them. And then you begin building tools around them, and then often industry comes in and forgets you were there in the first place. So we felt like putting that into legislation might raise the bar.
And I'm going to ask Christine to go next, because Christine really, when her daughter was diagnosed, elevated GM1 as a disease and really attracted the investment. So Christine, can you tell us a little bit about your efforts?
GM1 gangliosidosis is actually a sister disease to a more well-known disease, which is GM2 gangliosidosis. You might not know that. That is Tay-Sachs disease. And so GM1 actually has a higher incidence than Tay-Sachs disease and has been sitting to the side. And I think the reason for that is that Tay-Sachs was first discovered 100 years earlier. And it wasn't until 1968 that GM1 was clinically distinguished. So as we came along, and there were still no clinical trials, there practically no pipeline, and we just realized we couldn't sit on our hands and do nothing, and we looked into the scientists. So we started fundraising. My only prior experience fundraising was Girl Scout cookies, and we raised millions of dollars and basically stoked a explosion in GM1 clinical trials. So sadly, a couple of them was shut down, but the disease has existed since the 1800s, and in the past 5 years, we had 4 clinical trials. So we've been directly involved in bringing awareness and in rallying the community together, and also working to support drug development in many different ways, including data sharing and newborn screening and biomarkers and all sorts of things, animal models.
Great. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn it to you next. So, you have these patient organizations and they are fueling the investment. But then what happens when you go to a company and you encourage them to develop the treatment? And one of the things that I really admire about FAST is, as Christine also mentioned, companies fail. What happens to that product? So Christine, can you tell me a little bit about what FAST is doing to ensure that you can protect the pipelines for Angelman?
Yeah, we've learned a lot along the way. So FAST is singularly focused on the advancement of therapeutics for Angelman syndrome because there are no treatments. It's a rare genetic neurodevelopmental disorder. And we have raised money to invest in research and to sponsor research ourselves. And something we've learned is that you've got to maintain some control of that asset because it can get deprioritized. And I'll give you an example. We funded proof of concept work for gene therapy over 8 years ago. And that was at an academic lab. That candidate got licensed by a company, and that company started developing it, and we also provided investment to that company. Then that company got sold to company 2, and company 2 deprioritized it in their pipeline, and it sat there, and they came to our annual meeting every year and told us they were 18 months from the clinic. Well, earlier this year, they killed that program because they downsized and deprioritized programs, and we have no access to that. We can't get it back. So what we have learned over time is that when we provide investment or we license technology, then we need to make sure that we have the means to shuttle it to someone that's going to prioritize it, or that we can get it back if the program is killed. Because we don't want to see money that comes from our community through bake sales and golf tournaments and bowling tournaments just get wasted and go nowhere.
Great, thank you. So Everin has done, is a patient. It's always really important to include caregivers, but also real patients and young adult patients. I know a great focus on diversity. Young people are an incredibly important voice in our patient community. But Everin actually started his advocacy efforts by testifying at the FDA. Can you talk a little bit about your efforts there?
Yes, so my very first advocacy experience really talking about ASMD was when I was on a small panel that was invited to the Food and Drug Administration, and I really just gave my testimony. I shared my story about how living with this rare genetic disease really affects me, and just it's important for people at the FDA to be able to see an actual person and understand, like, we're waiting for a treatment, and it's important for them to see the actual person and hear their experience. One thing I think the FDA found really interesting from my perspective or my story is there's a lot written in the notes and about my disease that it's left out. There's a lot of things that are just left out, like symptoms I face. So to hear it from an actual person, they get to really hear that some things that may not be heard, like, for example, my eyes, that's not always mentioned in the literature about ASMD, so they really got to hear about that. And just, it's so important to have a patient there to see that there's someone and they need to work hard to see this.
Great. Adrian, I'm going to call on you. I know you've done some work at 6 Cells to help companies with clinical trial design as well as market access. Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, I have to say thank you. And being in sickle cell, I am living my greatest dream, as we are like months away from FDA approval, so I have to. And I am grateful to my community, my sickle community, but also my rare community for helping to uplift us and in many ways take us, because we had no voice. We had no voice, we had no presence, we had no one looking for anything for us. And when we entered this space, you uplifted us. So I want to say thank you. Sorry. So I didn't answer the question. What was the question again?
The question is, can you give us some...
the clinical trial.
The clinical trial, the work you did on clinical trials.
So when we were invited to the clinical trials, you could imagine, right? After not being invited to anything, suddenly here we are on clinical trials. And I'm sitting in the room with all the scientists, and I'm a mom, so I'm a mom. I've got a lot of other skills, but I'm only here because I'm a mom, and I was a sister to an older brother with sickle. And the scientists are all talking, right? And I'm like, okay, I get it. I had to learn the science before the meeting. But when they got to the patient profile, I read it, and I said, well, why this patient? And they all looked at me and said, well, this patient has sickle cell SS. I said, well, yeah, but why this patient? This is clearly not a good candidate for your trial. You want your trial to succeed. They're like, yes. And I'm like, well, this patient doesn't have, and I had a whole list of things the patient didn't have in order to make them a good candidate, right? So the patient had no home support, can't get there. The patient had lived an hour and a half. Now, hour and a half in LA, right, turns into 3 hours, 4 hours. Patient did not drive. I mean, all the reasons that this patient was not going to be able to show up and do the things that needed to be done. Had strained relationship with family, so no real support. And so when I started talking to them about it, they all just looked at me. And they were like, oh, but they'd already picked her, right? She was already in process. So that failed. It literally failed. She couldn't show up. She didn't show up. There were all these complications. And I was like, where's your psychosocial support, right? Where is someone to hold this candidate's hand? Where are we going to get money in order to make these things happen that need to happen? And it took a little while, but all of a sudden in the meetings, I had parity with they could see my value. I was the subject matter expert on living with this disease and had learned enough about clinical trials to where I could speak their language and could show them, what was important and why. It was life-changing, and they took a lot of my suggestions and shared it, and now all across the trials, they have this psychosocial component. They have an emotional IQ component, because they didn't understand things like silent strokes and how that, many things that aren't documented or looked at as symptoms. So in the few years, and I say few, it's been 10, but that's nothing in medical research. It has been so rewarding to see when they give us the table and respect us, and now they invite us to everything, right? We're in here. So, yeah.
So great benefits. It's really important to engage patients early, not after you start the clinical trial, really from the very beginning to help design trials, to help determine your endpoints. I recently heard an amazing success story from a company who did good patient engagement, and they went to market 10 months early. Imagine what that does for your company if you can go to market with your drug 10 months early. It's cost savings, more profitability. So hugely important to make sure that you're engaging patients early. Pat, I'm going to turn it back to you. And we talked a little bit last night about how there's been great successes in Duchenne, but it's not necessarily the top priority for gene and cell therapy for your community because it doesn't solve for everyone. And so can you tell me a little bit about how your community is feeling and also your work around the immune tolerance for redosing?
Sure. We, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, first of all, is a disease primarily of males. It's X-linked. And so it follows a pretty traditional course where these children are born looking quite normal, but over the course of 20 years, they will lose all function. So average age of loss of ambulation is 11 to 13 years old. Average age of loss of hand-to-mouth function is in the 15, 16. And then death occurs by usually heart failure. But these patients live to be now 30 or 40 because we are employing medical tools. But at the time of 16, they are not really able to move. We were lucky enough this year to receive a gene therapy approval. So June 22nd, we received our first gene therapy approval. Now the Duchenne, or the dystrophin gene, is so large it doesn't fit into an AAV serotype. So the types of proteins that are in there are very small, called micro or mini dystrophins. And so we're delivering a mini dystrophin using an AAV serotype, but that does not get into the satellite cells. So we see benefit. We don't know the durability of that benefit because we have so few patients that are out 4 or 5 years. But it seems to give most, not all, patients some benefit. But again, in the durability, if we're looking at a patient who grows and it's not in those satellite cells, you have to have more. There's going to have to be a robust, and I'm not supposed to say combination therapies, but add-on therapies to really preserve what's there in gene therapy and stop the disease around Duchenne. So we are really thinking through, how do you get these add-on therapies? How do you move forward and I think every rare disease here recognizes that we're going to need add-on therapies, not combinations, but add-on therapies. And so we have to think about, how do we do that safely? Mm-hmm. Recognizing that time means everything to these patients when they're losing muscle, in our case, day after day. So how do we do that safely? How do we do that mindful of time? And how do we get the payers to agree that what is benefit? Because what we're seeing and what we've seen is we have 4 antisense oligonucleotides approved. in our space, which is great for patients who are amenable to that. And what we have experienced is patients who are trying to access gene therapy, which is a label from 4 to 5 years old, they have to wash out of the antisense and then receive a gene therapy that's approved. And then the clinician receives a note from the payer that says, you may not resume the antisense oligonucleotide therapy unless you see significant decline. Well, we don't want to see significant decline. That's the whole point of this. So we have to think through, how do we get to add-on therapies? And that's where we are now. We're going to work with our community. First and foremost, the patients will be able to say that this is a need, an unmet need, and they want to preserve what they have received from a gene therapy or any other therapeutic. We're going to work with the payers to understand, what is it that you expect to learn or need to learn? What data do you need to convince you that add-on therapies are essential? What do you want to know so that you pay for those? So we're in the process of looking with and publishing the need for these therapies with our clinicians, with our patients. We're doing benefit risk or preference studies, and we're collecting through our registry real-world evidence so that we can provide the holistic view of these patients and the pushing out of those timelines.
So talking about payers, Adrian, can you tell me a little bit about what happened when ICER announced that they were going to be looking into sickle cell and what the patient community had to do to address that?
So again, I said we had nothing really. We had nothing for sickle cell for 120 years, and suddenly we were getting 3 treatments all at once. And we never expected ICER to look at it, but ICER comes up and it says, oh, well, it's our job to look and determine whether or not has the monetary value, right? So there's only so much money in the pot, and we have to look at the prices. Well, okay. So we are a very tiny organization at that point. I think there were three people on payroll and a board members of heart and mind, meaning we all had skills, and we said, okay, we're going to do this. So in order to do this, what do we need to do? So we were the subject matter experts in living with the disease. So we could tell you all about living with sickle. We did not know anything about economic models. So we were like, okay, deep dive, we got to learn so we can have a conversation. And we learned enough to realize that we need to hire health economists, because there was no way that we were going to be able to have any real input without that on our side. We had a chat with ICER, and they said, oh, we really welcome you. We want to be partners. And we said, great, all right, we're going to be partners. We're going to work this out. Well, the first thing they started talking to us was about things like equality and equity. And I'm like, wait a minute. So, okay, but you do realize we're Black. So how are you going to, in your economic model, you got to be real about it, right? You cannot talk about healthcare, and they use the term equity. We just want equal, because now we have same, so you can go to the same hospitals, but you don't get the same care. So it's not. So we thought, great, and they said, yes, we're going to do this. So we said, what do we need to do? What do you need from us? So they said, well, we need information. So we just energized. We put out the word in the community. We had people over. We had phone lines going. We were doing surveys. We were doing letters. We were collecting information. Altogether was over 1,400 hours, right? It cost us $59,000. Now we're talking about bake sales, selling old jewelry. Anything we needed to do, we were doing to get this thing together. And taking pressure from the outside of people saying you shouldn't engage with them, because they're going to tell you that you don't have value. But we were really like, we have to go through this. This is the first of the beginning, and so we need to know what we're dealing with. And we hoped we were dealing with something new and different, and we weren't. But what we did was we set a model for other diseases that came after us. that chose to go through this process, right, on the things that they could do. So ICER had never had an organization come to them and say, oh yeah, so here's a survey done, we sent it out to 500, 600 people, here is our report, you know, a 28-page report, here's all the data. That for them was really very different. And for us to be able to do that, how can I say this, made us feel more in control. Because even though we knew they were going to come back and tell us it wasn't valuable enough, we knew we had the data that proved that it was. And so it was quite an experience, and as a woman of color, you know, we're in a room where there aren't a whole lot of people that look like us, and we have to take on having these discussions that are very uncomfortable for both sides of us. And I think we're making progress. I have to say too, now we go in when we have these discussions and we say we're here as subject matter experts for this disease. We bring along all our education. Many times we aren't paid for any of those things. We bring along, you know, all our skill, and we are here full on with you as equals to make things better. But we are not here to help you or to teach you about bias. And so that's really hard because you can't talk, look at me, I'm here talking to you now, and I'm like, okay, can I say this? Can I not say this? Should I? Sorry. So I think that too is very, to the companies, that we are giving you the best we have. We are investing, I mean, really, that's a lot of money. Everything we have, we are not funded like most organizations. You know all about that. I don't have to tell you all about that. So we're really coming to you. So what we have to be able to say to you, this is how you can get the best from us. But we need you coming to the table, having done some of the work, so that we don't feel like we have to do the work, be the expert in the disease, be the expert of being a person who is an outsider in the culture to talk to you about that you come to us having done some of that footwork yourselves. And there are amazing programs out there and that do a good job. And yeah.
Well, I think this really showcases the expertise that patients bring beyond just the expertise in their disease. They've now become experts in clinical trials and access. Christine, I know one of the things that you've been leading is the data sharing effort, and as well as you've actually worked with a drug company to expand their trial to ensure that more patients were enrolled. Can you talk a little bit more about those things?
I mean, there aren't a lot of patient organizations for ultra-rare diseases, and actually, you know, even though our disease is over 100 years old, we're the only 501c3 entirely dedicated to the condition. So we've actually, even though we're a tiny organization and we have to work really, really hard to fundraise because it's ultra-rare and ultra-severe, we are in touch globally with the community. We are in touch with all of the physicians and the sites. And when a company comes along and just entirely new to the space, we can offer a lot of guidance and information. And obviously we know our disease and we know it deeply. And we're looking across the entire field, and the recent thing that we've done is we've been working on setting up a data sharing consortium. If there's anyone who's done that, it's mega hard. So really, really hard. You have to have multi-party agreement. I mean, it is really hard to get people to share their data. But for an GM1 has an incidence of 1 in 100,000 to 200,000. So the data really matters, and knowing where the people are and being in contact with them really, really matters. So what we've been looking at is incredible data silos where data has not been shared, and that our community is constantly being asked to do new natural history studies. And frankly, for our disease, it's incredibly hard, and where the disease is so severe. And you can only give so many lumbar punctures and give so many MRIs to your child. So what we want is for people to share their data and to put it in, a publicly funded repository. So we're currently working with Critical Path Institute, but it needs to be done for the good of the community, for the good of the science, for actually to also benefit the biotech companies. It's just will radically change the field, and it's something that we've been working very hard at putting together, and I really hope we'll have some great announcements to make soon. But that is something that actually the companies told us, and also the academic centers, they said, you are uniquely fitted to this problem to be able to ask and actually demand of people that they take part in this effort. And so advocacy has that really, really unique role of being that custodian and organizer.
Thank you. Jennifer, I'm going to ask you, there was a panel yesterday on ethics. I don't know if anyone sat through that, but I did want to make sure that we touch on this because the patient organizations also bear the brunt of the ethics and how that works in their community. So Jennifer, do you want to talk a little bit about what your community is facing in gene therapy?
Absolutely. We know that there are several gene therapies in development for Angelman syndrome, and we've talked about the ethics a lot because we've heard and we know that FDA is asking for sham controls in some CNS-administered gene therapy programs, including for disorders that are more severe in their presentation than Angelman syndrome. Our kids have seizures, they have severe cognitive impairment, they have communication deficits. About 80 to 90% will never achieve any verbal speech in their lifetime, so it is profound. And the thought about enrolling your child in a gene therapy study where they may not receive the treatment but undergo a sham procedure is really concerning for families. We conducted a survey of caregivers in our community to ask them, what's your attitude towards gene therapy for this disorder? And more than 75% said favorable, where we would be interested in a gene therapy for our child. But then when we asked them about the prospect of a sham and going through a procedure to make them think that their child had had the gene therapy, over 60% said no, and the remaining responders said, I don't know. Nobody said yes. No one said, yes, I would absolutely enroll my kid in a gene therapy study that has to go through a sham. Because it's really intensive. It's ICM or ICV or bilateral injection. So you're talking about anesthesia. These kids have such severe cognitive and behavioral issues that there's no way you're not going to use anesthesia. Even for a lumbar puncture with the oligonucleotides, they're using sedation. So you have to go through that procedure, and we see that described on clinicaltrials.gov as a sham in which there are partial twist or burr holes without penetration of the dura mater. And we've talked to clinicians and neurosurgeons who said that's a dicey consideration in children. They wouldn't want to be responsible for having to perform the sham procedure where you're just going through a little bit. That's concerning. And then you have to go through the procedure twice, even if there's a promise that you're going to get the gene therapy later. Is it a year later? Is it 2 years later? And you're putting your child through that procedure twice. Are they going to have steroids that they don't need? Is a company going to have to manufacture placebo steroids? These are considerations that are real and really concerning for our community. And so it's something that we're grappling with, and we'd really like to see more open attitudes towards ways in which we could measure benefit, because we're looking for big swings, not small marginal effects here in these developmental disorders, and we think that there are ways to implement creative and novel trial designs to get at this without making families go through this prospect of a sham.
So Everett, I'm going to turn it to you. Those are really difficult things, but I do want to highlight a really good example of patient engagement. So you have had an opportunity to work with a pharmaceutical company to do good patient engagement. Can you tell us your experience?
Yes, so I've worked alongside with the company Sanofi that has developed my treatment and enzyme replacement therapy. So the patient perspective and with the drug company and pharmaceutical companies is so important. It's so important for these people at these companies to see an actual patient and hear from us. Two opportunities that really stood out to me as being a patient speaker to Sanofi have been, one, I've gotten to serve on a panel to speak to their marketing team. So they brought some flyers and brochures in for us to review and look at. And they wanted to hear our perspective and understand what we thought of these materials that they would be sharing with the public. So the first thing we noticed as patients was that person on the brochure or flyer does not look like me. So we expressed that to Sanofi, their marketing team, and then they really took that into perspective and understood and listened to us. They gave me the opportunity, and some of my other friends who have ASMD, they invited us, and we're included in the marketing process. They used us as models for their brochures, and that was super exciting for me and some of my friends. So we really they listened to us. They just took our perspective into account, which is very important. And then the second opportunity, I got to go speak to Thermo Fisher, which works alongside with Sanofi to create my enzyme. So there was this young man working in this lab, and I think he was about ready to quit or give up on his job. He really didn't see the purpose. But after I got to go present and he saw the physical person that he was helping and making a difference in their life, he got to show us the lab, and I think it really changed his mind and perspective, and that the work he is doing is very important. So the patient perspective is just so important, and I recommend that people here just give the chance to work with the actual patient and hear their stories and perspectives, and for people there to know that the work they're doing is saving lives and changing families' lives.
Great. Yeah, go ahead. You want to?
So what I want to say is, I really believe, and you see us here talking, and for so long we've been all siloed by our diseases. You have this disease, sickle is too big to be a rare disease. I mean, but what this industry has done is, and this science has done is, it's made us all come and realize that we're equal. Everybody's got these stem cells. And these still magical cells are going to be able to do something for all of us. But the other part of it is that as somebody does something in one lab, if it fails, it may help another. And so I encourage the industry to share. We talked about this yesterday. Share what you're learning. Many of you are sharing what you're doing with groups. I mean, I heard Dave was on the cover. My girl got to be on the cover. Before that, we had stock photos, and we were like, oh my God, who did that girl's makeup? So again, we're all learning. But if we could, in this, really, I think we have to talk about the good stuff. The good stuff is that this is a great equalizer. Now, access to it, quality of care, those are all challenges. But when you really look at this science proves that we're all human, right? And those differences of us are these little tiny things. So I really want you to take that away wherever you fit in this space, that whatever we're doing here, however we're contributing, we're ending generations, 5 generations that we know in my family, right, of pain and suffering. And that should always, I think, be your North Star, so that you want to give it your best. And we see so many of you giving your best, so, and giving us this community. And I want to thank you for bringing us all together and letting us do this. Thank you.
Do we have time? I'm really confused by the clock down there. Do we have time
we
for
have the clock.
questions from the audience? Yes? Okay. Okay. If anyone has, I have more questions, but if anyone has more questions, happy to. They all agreed ahead of time that they are willing to take questions from the audience. So if anyone has anything for the panel. Great. Patients are not scary. Ask them questions. It's really important. Good modeling behavior for everyone. People are so afraid to talk to the patient advocates. So I really want to encourage everyone to ask questions.
So I heard you talking about going to different governing bodies to talk to them about funding. And I know in government, the people that work there are always changing because of elections, and the plans that you have in place for the funding, do they ever change because of the changing government? Like, do you have any issues with funding being affected or plans being changed?
Pat, Pat has done an amazing model of what you should do to get funding for rare diseases. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. First of all, funding does change, right? Because Congress changes, because who serves on what committee changes. I think what we've really learned about this is organizing our community and developing messages that are consistent. Because what we learned is if everyone in the community goes to Congress and their representatives and says something different, Congress struggles to act anyway. Do you know? So I think if you really sort of design a strategy, and everyone is on that same strategy, so you have your 3 asks, and this is what we really do. We have 3 asks every year, and we work with the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to get those 3 asks. So we have all of our patients go to their representatives. They tell their story about how their child was diagnosed or how they were diagnosed with this disease, and then the 3 asks are consistent. Our asks are always about the Center for Disease Control, which is collecting surveillance data for the National Institutes of Health to invest in this disease, and for we have a congressionally directed medical research program at the Department of Defense, and that's an annual earmark by a certain committee. So I think you have to get your strategy, and it does. I mean, next year, when in an election year, it'll be much harder to get our voice. But I think the basic thing is you have to all be rowing in the same direction, right? And I think this is about community as well. We talk to our community about what are the things we need. What's the most important? I ran a couple ICUs in my early career, and I always ask the patient, what's the one thing you need? And so many docs would say, oh, they want magic and cures. They just want improved quality of life, right? And that's fair. I was in an ICU where we had great loss of patients, and I asked one person what was the one thing they needed, and they said, if I'm going to die, I want my family around me. Something I never thought about, right? Because we were fancy and smart. So I think this is where consistent messaging of what you need done. Also, you have to learn who's your representative. I think that all of us are represented by 2 senators and a person in the House in our area. Get to know them. You're allowed to get to know them. You can meet them at home. You can meet them in Washington. You can tell them what's important to you. And it's not just a one-time thing where you introduce yourself. This is like dating in marriage, maybe, or finding a partner. You have to go and share your story and listen to theirs. And it doesn't hurt to say, I know your partner's having a birthday. Happy birthday. I'm thinking about you. Keep in mind, I'm still working in my particular disease. I think this is about relationships and communication and consistent messaging in an uncertain world. And I think that's where you have to go with your community.
And then one more thing. So we do have that point on. So once you get that in place, the other thing you have to keep it, you have to be consistent, right? Because there's just too much and they're being hit. But the other thing is that it's not just the legislators, all right, who can make things happen. So you have the people in the FDA who can become champions for you, the CDC, HHS, NIH. So sickle made these huge strides in the midst of one of the most tumultuous times in our history, right? And so people will look and say, well, wait a minute, what happened under that administration? HBCUs got this and sickle got that. And you know what it was? It was all those people that had careers in those federal institutions who believed and had money that they could use and believed that they could do something and saw an opportunity. So it's not just that, it is really understanding the system. And that in itself, as you all know, that can be really intimidating. But the thing is this, is if you know what it is you need and your message is consistent and you show up and you speak out, you're gonna find your support. And I know that you guys all have those phones and they tell you everything should happen and be beautiful and all that, but it's really not like that, right? It takes a lot of work to have those beautiful moments. So kind of like, who was it, Kardashian woman went and had a beauty makeup at the MDV, to get her license so it looked good. So you only saw the picture. But there are all of these people wanting to do good, right? And you get to them and you help them by giving them the information and sharing what's important. And as they rise, you will rise, your need will rise, what you want and what you deserve. So it is also the elected officials, and don't forget that it's really run by DC and Sacramento, run by young people like you guys.
I think the other thing is that policies, a lot of policies like PFDD, patient-focused drug development, are really affecting all of us.
That's right.
So we gather with the ELF Foundation or the EveryLife Foundation, and we talk about policies, and then we do congressional letters, and these are all about consistency, about this matters to not just PPMD, and not just to sick cells, and not just to FAST, and all of our programs. It matters to all of us. So these are joining ELF with Julia Jenkins and her crew. There are other organizations such as this, where we're all working together on something that's important to all of us. And I think that it is about showing up, it is about signing on, and it is about looking at what's important to you in terms of a general policy, patient-focused drug development, other policies going through to support the NIH research, to support the Center for Disease Control. All of these matter at the end of the day, and then meeting your representatives and creating your story and that relationship and showing up. I think that's most important here.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Oh, yes, I love it.
Hi, Keith March from the University of Florida Center for Regenerative Medicine. So we do a number of different cell therapy trials, and we certainly involved in writing them. I typically like to use a crossover design so that everyone gets the opportunity to use the test agent, as was discussed in several of these points that were raised. I was particularly intrigued, Jennifer, by your comments about that crossover design that wasn't particularly palatable, let's say, and how to perhaps improve that. And I must tell you, I'm not familiar with the specifics of that clinicaltrial.gov description that you mentioned, but I do wonder, in any given disease, when you think about this crossover design, you want a long enough period so that there can be clear evidence that there was an improvement. But in some cases like this disease, the historic controls are so clear that you certainly might want to modify that. But even if that weren't the case, the question becomes, from a clinical design point of view, what's the necessary length of time that we can make as short as possible to begin to see what we hope will be an improvement, so that we then can do a crossover and the others who were in the other arm didn't have to wait too long. And so for a particular disease, this is a general question. I mean, we had this with an osteoarthritis one, and this is not a rare disease. We were thinking about how long until people will improve in their knees so we can see something, and then the other people can get treated. Exactly the same questions. So disease by disease, I think it would be very interesting to have a dialogue across the panel, maybe to some degree here, but even subsequently, how do you look at that balance between waiting for the crossover and giving the opportunity for that crossover for the other arm that was a placebo control? And I don't know if there's any group that does that, but it seems that would be a very healthy dialogue to have, because it's a pretty clear idea of what you said. And it doesn't matter any disease, even the non-rare ones. No one wants to be in the placebo arm. People often talk about equipoise from an ethical perspective, but obviously I think the counterposition to that is that no one would be doing a trial unless there was a reasonable understanding and belief that there was some reason that the test agent is going to work. So, everybody wants to try a test agent, which is very reasonable. Just some thoughts and question behind it, I guess.
Yeah, your points are well taken. I think, it's that duration really is important. It's something that we've considered. We had a meeting at the Simons Foundation for Autism Research on this earlier this year with some other neurodevelopmental disorders, and I think it really depends. If we're thinking about encephalopathic disorders or degenerative disorders, right? So if the readout is relatively short, and I know that there's a study on clinicaltrials.gov right now in a seizure disorder that has a sham proposed, and they're looking for a readout maybe in a very short amount of time, maybe 4 months' time, based on seizure activity or reduction in seizure activity. But what we've heard from that sponsor is that FDA feels like it should actually be much longer, that duration should really be much longer. And that's where the challenge is. And it's not going to be the same for everyone, because it's going to be endpoint driven. If you can't read out that endpoint in a short amount of time, then your sham needs to be longer. And that's one of the issues is, okay, yes, maybe the patient will go on and get access to the therapy once the sham period is over, and we hope it's short. But there's a second issue, which is it really an effective means to control the trial? Many of the parents feel like they'll know right away. I can tell you from the experience in Angelman syndrome, and we have almost 15 years of natural history data, those kids don't really move. You don't get spontaneous improvements. They don't really gain a lot of skills or lose them because they're not declining. They're just on a super slow plateau in terms of their developmental ability. Some of them never really progress beyond the capabilities of a 3-year-old. So it's not something we would expect to change as part of the natural history. And so then the question is, what is the sham really doing, and why put somebody through 2 surgeries if they don't really need it?
And I was going to say, when we got called during our ICER review for our stem cell therapies, and part of the comments was that we didn't really have a clinical trial because there was no placebo group, right? So I think it is, we have to look at, medicine is moving and things are different, so we need to maybe come up with some more creative ways. I know in sickle we got 3 treatments. Some of the trials were only 30 days, so that seemed kind of reasonable. Others were 12 to 18 months, and that at the point seemed reasonable, but once the medicine was approved and I put my daughter on it, she went from being in the hospital 9 months out of the year to being like able to wash her own clothes and have conversations and have a life in a matter of 6 months. So, that I'm like, if you could have that, right, and you're signed up for the clinical trial and you're still going through all these painful episodes for all of these months, is that right? So I think it's something we really need to be looking at and convening on and saying, are we trying to take these models that were appropriate for what we knew then, right, and kind of make them work for what we know now? That I think it's part of this new paradigm shift and new way of doing medicine.
And really making sure that the patients are part of that conversation, right?
Exactly.
That's what we're here today.
Exactly.
It's like, yes, this is, you're making a decision on the trial, but if you don't actually hear from the patients
Right.
that you're trying to serve, you're not going to actually be effective in what you're doing.
And I think in natural history controls, especially in rare or slowly progressive diseases, you really need a robust natural history and think through that. Because for instance, in gene therapy studies, 70% of the patients on active product are vomiting within 12 to 24 hours. So it's not a big secret who's receiving active gene therapy. And, you know, again, with surgeries or with anesthesia, all of these are risks for these populations. So I think we really have to think through more different designs for clinical trials. And with regard to the length of the placebo, time matters, right? Time means decline on all of these patients. So I think we have to think differently about clinical trials. I hope FDA is willing to think differently and use natural history controls so that we don't have these long placebo-controlled studies. We also formed a group at New York University called PGTME. It's Pediatric Gene Therapy Medical Ethics. And this is where a group, Art Kaplan and others, are taking on these kind of ethical issues. Because if we have a trial that's up with an 18-month placebo on patients who are losing ambulations, well, they will lose ambulation. If they're on placebo, they're going to lose ambulation. And we know from our outcome measures, if time to stand is greater than 10 seconds, this person will lose ambulation within 18 months. So why the 18-month placebo? So this is where involving patients early and often is going to be essential.
In our case, we've had 3 gene therapy trials for GM1 gangliosidosis, and not a single sponsor ever proposed a placebo. In our case, the disease is so severe and it primarily impacts infants. And so the idea of doing a sham brain surgery on an infant was just unacceptable. So we're grateful for that.
One more back there.
Hi there, Christina Hartman from Bluebird Bio. We're a rare disease gene therapy with 2 products on the market, and our PDUFA date for sickle cell is this December. Thank you so much to all of you for your perspective. One of the things that we found at Bluebird that's really important is not just the gene therapy, but looking at the wraparound care and services that our patients require. From your perspective, what can the cell and gene medicine sector do to support patients beyond just the science, and how important is that to you?
I'm going to go first because I can't help it. Well, I think if all of you who are trying to help people who have chronic and severe illnesses would help us lobby to have people under, that live with these things put under palliative care. So under palliative care, the whole reason for this thing, right, is so that you have the best care and the best life you have while you are living with this illness. So these teams are already, they're teams, right? They have pain control, they have social support. They're used to interfacing with experts. They are not part of the whole opioid epidemic, because the minute it says palliative care, the little red box does not pop up and say you're giving them too much pain medicine. And so 85% of what we need to have good care is already built into that. And then you need your 15% of your expert. And so I'm all for building special clinics and having special things. We had amazing clinics for sickle. For 10 years, we had these amazing clinics, and my brother benefited from it. But after the federal funding went away, the clinics went away. And now we're having trouble finding good care. They're starting the clinics again. But again, if we're really looking at, there's only so much money and what's happening with our population, and as we get smarter and identify more and more problems and corrections, I think going more towards that whole person model of care. So that's my idea.
Everett, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, I recently spoke to the patient support services sector at Sanofi, and something like this is very important for patients. One of the things they did for me was they came out flew out and explained to me how this treatment was going to work, and they were there if I had any questions. Also, we had a case manager that worked with my family all that time on the phone with insurance companies. So just having an overall patient support services network within the company is just really important to patients and their families.
Other questions? I don't know where the microphone went, but. Oh, okay. That's great. We don't want to be loud.
Hi, my name is Namo. I'm a part of the GROW program. First, I want to say thank you all for coming to us. This has been fantastic. Thank you. As someone that's kind of stepping into the gene therapy world as a current student, I think it can be a little bit daunting with tasks like these, since we feel like in order to make an impact, we have to wait until we're on a board or become a director or get to a higher position. Do you have any experiences with people first stepping into the field that have made an impact? And do you have examples that we can possibly take into the future for that?
Oh, nonprofits always need help. Whether you're I mean, students are wonderful, interns are wonderful. Yes. So, I mean, I think if you reached out to any rare disease nonprofit or any, they would be grateful for anyone who's offering their knowledge and skills to volunteer. So, please don't hesitate.
Yeah, unfortunately, patient communities are extremely under-resourced. So luckily our panel here today has industry that's interested in them, but there are hundreds of organizations out there that don't even have industry that care about them at all, and they are in a worse situation. But we tried to have a representation of good patient engagement, but really, just elevating rare diseases in general. People don't know that there's 10,000 different rare diseases. People don't know that 1 in 10 Americans will get a rare disease. That means in your lifetime, you will unfortunately probably be impacted, either you or your family or a neighbor or someone your child might play with in the future will end up with a rare disease. It's actually quite common. And really kind of elevating the importance of science. There is a massive attack on science in our nation and actually globally, and really elevating the importance of science and research and the possibilities. Our patient communities are waiting for treatments and cures, and the work that you guys are doing is really important. And just being with the patients, I always encourage people to stay with it. Even if you're not working on the community, if you've worked on that community, stay with the community, because you have made an impact on their life. They're going to remember you when you move on. People and companies move on to different companies, and a lot of times patient organizations will really feel abandoned by the person because they have that personal relationship, and this is personal to everyone that is doing this work.
And I was going to say, so there are programs where you can become a California Institute of Regenerative Medicine has a program for, they don't call it ambassadors, but ambassadors? Okay, ambassadors. And so you sign up. And what that is you basically get trained on how to tell people about stem cell research and why it's good, right? And this is something that you can then share. So it's kind of meeting you where you are. And also, there are 2 others. I'll give them to your 2 other organizations. And so that's the power. You don't realize what power you have. You're talking to other friends, you're talking at your churches, your sororities, fraternities, that kind of thing. But having that succinct ability to describe what the work is, why it's important, and what's interesting about it. And then once you find your space and land in your internship, right, you can then, how can I put it? You'll make relationships, and then you'll be able to increase your sphere of influence. Because that's really what it is. It's your connectivity and your influence. We're all here because we love somebody who was really, really sick. You see? So And you may have a conversation with someone who has somebody really, really sick, or you might have a conversation with someone who says, I just like tinkering around with things, right? I like analyzing things, and you can talk to them. So we'll make sure you get those organizations, because you're going to be pretty busy. And if you get involved with a community-based organization, you're going to really be busy. But
So
just start
we just
there.
got we're over time. So do you want one more thing?
Sorry.
First of all,
I'm sorry,
you
I
are the
talked
next
too much.
generation of people who are going to drive therapy development. And so we are all
Yeah.
grateful to see you. You're all really bright people. If there's someone who's touched your life, someone who made you curious about cell and gene therapy, and they have a disease or a diagnosis, you just need to call the foundation. I know if someone calls us, we say, come to our conference, which is a little overwhelming, 800 parents, but that's where you're connected. If you say, I'd like to even think about a job, do you have one open? A lot of us would be very thankful to have you, because you are what we need now. And the way you think and the way you listen and the way you can act. We are happy to have you, and I can't thank you enough for being interns. And I think that GROW program should really grow. That's what I think.
We're going to help them grow.
Thank you. Thank you to our amazing panel. Thank you to ARM for having us.